Thanks, Heidi, for coordinating and for setting it up. And thanks, Daniel, for making the time and to share some of your work. So I think for those of you who didn't manage to read Daniel's bio, I'll just do a very quick intro and then we'll kick off, and there should be some time for questions at the end. So Daniel Elkin is a researcher and designer who specializes in spatial agency research and agency-driven design. So he is an assistant professor and deputy discipline lead of the Department of Environment of Interior Design at the Hong Kong Polytechnic University. So he was educated at Cranbrook Academy of Art and the University of Cincinnati in the US, and his multidisciplinary career spans between architecture, product design, art, and activism. So since moving to Hong Kong, he's established a research focus in spatial agency, contributing to scholarly publications and agency-driven design work. He served as the Cubic Journal Design Making Issue First Editor, as the fabrication supervisor for the School of Design's 2020-2021 Venice Biennale contribution, and is the founder of the HomeWise Research and Design Housing Data Gathering Platform. So his recent work studies the unique development conditions of Tai O Village in a spatial agency living lab format. So thanks, Daniel, and over to you. You okay to share?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Mike. Let me see. So I had some trouble with this before, but are you able to see the PDF in full screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. So just let me know if there are any issues with that. So thanks, Mike, for the intro. Thank you, Heidi, for organizing and for having me, everybody. It looks like it's autoplaying, which is not what I wanted to do. Hi, I'm Dan Elkin. I'm an assistant professor at Hong Kong Polytechnic, as Mike said, and I'm here to talk about, this lecture is titled Spatial Agency Practice in Tai O Village, History, the Periphery, and Technology in Supporting a Data Commons. So this is a review of our most recent work and also some conceptualization of spatial agency research and practice to kind of give a framework for how I understand the work that we do and how it relates especially to design and architecture. And this is what I look like when I'm not wearing a t-shirt. So this is a graphic that I've developed to conceptualize my work and find a way to talk about how different aspects of the research and different aspects of the practice relate to one another. And it works from a Venn diagram of different fields of research on the outside. So that's what these three larger bubbles are, and then fields of practice on the inside. And I have just a couple of slides here that I'd like to show to give a little bit more background on my wider work before we talk about the work in Tai O, and at least from my point of view, conceptualize what spatial agency practice means and how I kind of think about that. So, for example, one of the things that is mentioned in my biography is this is a web application that we recently developed, which uses John F.C. Turner's system for evaluating housing suitability to gather data from visitors to the website. So basically you put in answers to 21 key survey questions, and this website delivers a comparison graphic between different factors and priorities that describe the way you live, what you expect from your housing, how much your housing delivers on that. And we launched this in December 2020 with the aim of gathering data on how people understand their housing, what their priorities are when they make housing decisions, and to hopefully develop a data set from that. So that's one aspect of what I've been working on that's really related to personal spatial agency. On the collective spatial agency side of things, I have a pretty substantial amount of work in spatial activism installations, both with students and on my own. This is a project that we did in Temple Street in Hong Kong as part of the first year program. And it's looking at using spatial installations as a way to articulate spatial goals that are beyond normative instrumental goals for how space should be used. And so students make these kind of wild site-specific installations, install them early in the morning, and use them to think about space, urbanity, and how different agencies' control over public space kind of works. I also do considerable work in construction technology and design for different building systems. This is a design for a demountable ceramic tile, extrusion tile, that I'm hoping to patent within the next year or two. And the whole point of it is that it allows serially demountable ceramic cladding with much more simplified tooling as compared to industrially fabricated systems. And this is something that I've been working on recently too, which is a wall system designed out of high density polyethylene as a vacuum insulated structurally supporting system for building housing. And basically the way that I think about how all this work relates, and this is partially responding to people who are asking me to profile my research agenda, is that all these different kinds of things and all these different ways of working, to me, respond to questions about spatial agency and how designers' practice can be influenced by spatial agency research in different directions. And so the way I think about it is spatial agency research asks questions regarding the ability to take action or choose what action to take, your personal, collective, or technological decision-making about space, presently and in the future. So we're asking questions like, who is allowed to make decisions? What decisions are different actors allowed to make? What constrains their field of decision-making? And what conflicts emerge at competing fields of decision-making? And when we talk about the transition from research to practice, spatial agency design practice centralizes these questions to design practice. So if we ask what the designer does, the designer has a lot of different fields of expertise, but when we think about it from a spatial agency point of view, the first question that the designer is asking themselves, himself, herself, themselves, is how do the designer's actions and choice of client, choice of program impact different agency structures around the work that they do? So this is kind of how I conceptualize my work. And with that, we can move forward into the work we're doing in Tai O. And I'll reference this diagram, which is really just how I think about things a couple times during the lecture. So let's talk about Tai O. Tai O is the site where I've been working myself and with some colleagues from the Department of Applied Social Sciences here at PolyU. And the first thing I want to talk about with Tai O is history. And this is an image of Tai O here on the right. If you see me looking off to the side, it's because I have my slides on my phone. I can kind of see ahead what is coming next. And just to quickly orient yourselves, in this case, north is down. We just kind of don't want to be too Eurocentric about how we expect ourselves to view the globe. And Cape Town's up here on the upper right. Hong Kong's on the lower left. It's a roughly 21-hour flight when you're able to fly. And Hong Kong is, of course, in the southern tip of Guangdong province in People's Republic of China. You can see some of my Google Maps stars there that are indicating where Hong Kong is. North is now up again. And the red outline is the first thing I want to talk about, which is the official title of how Hong Kong is conceived of as a political entity, which is the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region of the People's Republic of China. So it's a kind of unique political and economic entity that is functions kind of like a city-state as part of the People's Republic of China. And the reason why I want to talk about history regarding this and regarding Tai O is this has significant impacts on how land ownership and use of land development works in Hong Kong, which really contributes to how Tai O arrived in the conditions it is today. So in 1860, the Convention of Peking ceded Hong Kong to the British Empire as the colony of Hong Kong. And previous to this point, Hong Kong had existed for a while as a shipping center and a trade center for the Qing dynasty. And so when the British arrived and took over Hong Kong as the colony of Hong Kong was a smaller but long existing settlement. And it was a significant center of dynastic maritime power projection and the imperial salt monopoly. So the Qing dynasty had a monopoly on salt production, which meant that only certain imperial production centers were allowed to produce salt in any significant quantity. And Hong Kong and Tai O played a significant role in this. So prior to British colonization, Hong Kong was a significant settlement. And as I'll elaborate in a minute, so was Tai O. It has a pretty long, extensive history as an existing settlement. And so the colonial period in Hong Kong lasted from 1860 to 1997, when the British colony of Hong Kong was retrocessed to the People's Republic of China and became the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region. And along with racially motivated, racially defined land use and urban planning policies, there were significant policies enacted upon how land is used in Hong Kong during the colonial period that have very significant consequences for how land use and development happens in Hong Kong currently, and especially in Tai O. The significant ones are the 1844 Land Registration Ordinance, the 1890 Squatters Ordinance, the 1900 Crown Lands Resumption Ordinance, the 1982 and 1984 Squatter Structure and Occupation Surveys. And the law that transitions from the colonial period to the current period in 1997 is referred to as the Basic Law. The Basic Law is the law that sets up the structure of Hong Kong as a special administrative region with an executive council and a legislative council. And a major parts of the Basic Law are taking these policies that were set in the colonial era and transitioning them into the post-colonial era as standing policy. And this is just an image of Hong Kong during the colonial period. So when we talk about Tai O Village, and I'll give you some maps to orient you to where Tai O is within the rest of Hong Kong in a second. I think that one of the most significant things to talk about with Tai O's history is that it existed for a long time. It was present on Lantau Island for hundreds of years, settled by Tanka ethnic group and Hakka ethnic group people on the Tai O River estuary. And it was a significant settlement. It was larger than it is now. It was part of the Qing Dynasty salt production monopoly. There were salt production pans in Tai O. And it was not a small settlement. It was significantly larger in size. And some of my colleagues who have read Chinese language history books on Tai O have basically contended that if not for British colonization, Tai O might have been the CBD of the Central Business District of Hong Kong because of its connection with the Pearl River Delta and with Macau. So it used to be a much more significant settlement, whatever its state is today. And let's talk a little bit about where it is. So you can see here we have some magenta dots. This is Palau. This is the Central District, which is currently the Central Business District of Hong Kong. That's changing. But this is essentially where the British Empire decided to make the commercial and political center of Hong Kong. And Tai O is over here on the left. This is Lantau Island, as you can see here. And to kind of further orient you to what is happening in Tai O, Tai O's here on the left, and near Tai O we have Tung Chung, which is a growing, it's currently growing neighborhood to the northeast. This is where the nearest, what's called the MTR rail transit is located. And if you read any press about Hong Kong, you may know about the Nong Ping tourist attraction, which is where the big Buddha is. It's one of the first things that people hear about when they think about visiting Hong Kong. And if we look a little bit closer, this is a map of Tai O from above. And you can see we have a bus terminus here. The approach is generally from South Lantau Road. This is kind of the center of the village, and these are the stilt house districts that are there. And I'll talk more about the stilt houses in a second. And yeah, actually, I think I'll do that now. So one of the significant text about stilt houses is written by an architect named Yeung, and it's available on the Hong Kong Institute of Architects website. So these stilt houses are called in, my Cantonese is terrible, so they are Pang Uk, but there's obviously pronunciation errors with how that's said. And these are an evolution of sampan boats developed by Tanka fishermen, where they would build platforms over water to support their families while they went out fishing for the night. And over history, these evolved into a pretty significant agglomeration of vernacular architecture in Tai O. So you can see over here, kind of on the left side, there's the round-topped house. That's the first generation of stilt houses, which is more directly influenced by the sampan boat kind of type. And then over time, you see the evolution of these metal-clad, low-slope roofs that are increasing in size as the village grows and Hong Kong urbanizes. But this is one of the reasons why Tai O has become regionally and relatively globally famous for tourism, is because they have this really unique vernacular architecture that is there. And that evolved from the history of Tai O as a fishing and salt production settlement. You can see the salt pans here in the background, and there is pretty significant documentation of the salt production fields, which ceased production in the 1960s and 1970s. So yeah, this is just a little bit of history of Tai O, kind of how we got here. And these are some images from a book by Wang, who's a local anthropologist and stakeholder. And one of the reasons why Tai O is very popular as a place for people to visit is this idea of distinct culture, distinct way of living that is kind of different from a lot of the normative lifestyle that's around the rest of Hong Kong and the rest of the world. And that's honestly the reason why we started working there, is because as far as development patterns go, it's very distinct. It presents some unique challenges for working there, and it makes for interesting research. So that's why we're working there. But to return to colonial legacy policy, so the most significant thing that influences how development works and how land ownership works in Hong Kong is that it's actually not land ownership, it's leasing. So when the British took over Hong Kong as the colony of Hong Kong, they established the Crown Lands and Land Registration Ordinances, which essentially states that any real property existing in Hong Kong as a territory belongs to the Crown, and use of that land is subject to a Crown lease and taxation rates. So no one in Hong Kong actually owns the land that they build or develop on. They leased, during the colonial period, they leased it from the Crown, and after the transition in 1997, now people lease land from the government. So one of the significant things is the transitional government in 1997 took that same Crown land lease policy and made it a government land lease policy. So all land in Hong Kong belongs to the government at present. And also significantly, the 1890 Squatters Ordinance stated that any use of land without a lease and without paying taxation rates is squatting. And squatters is their terminology. Obviously there are terms that are a little bit more sensitive to how people use land, informal settlement, informal dwelling, however, whatever you want to call them. But in the policy terminology of Hong Kong, they refer to any structure that is on land without a lease as a squatter hut or a squatter structure. And in 1982 and 1984, the colonial government conducted the squatter structure and squatter occupation surveys, which surveyed structures and then occupants of informally developed areas in then colonial Hong Kong. So this is places like Diamond Hill, Shek Kip Mei, Shek O, which are all neighborhoods that had significant settlement of informal dwellings, especially after during the post-war period, where there was an influx of immigration from the north during the Cultural Revolution. And so after these two surveys, any dwelling or any structure that was included in those became known as a surveyed squatter structure in the government's terminology. So when a building becomes a surveyed squatter structure, it gets these numbers painted on the sides, which refer to the dimensions, the use, and the erection date or survey date of that dwelling. And this is a major factor in squatter and informal settlement clearance actions in Hong Kong. Diamond Hill and Shek Kip Mei are significant examples where entire communities of people were cleared out from areas of the city and rehoused in public housing. Alan Smart does considerable scholarship on this. You can read his articles for a really thorough history of squatter relocation in Hong Kong. And significantly, the Pang Uk stilt houses, which had existed in Tai O for a long time, were registered as surveyed squatter structures during these surveys. So this is a photograph that I took. This is one of the stilt houses in Tai O, and you can see the number on the side. And the contemporary policy is called the Squatter Control Policy on Surveyed Squatter Structures, which is a standing policy of the Lands Department of the Hong Kong government. And basically what it states for people who own stilt houses or other surveyed squatter structures is they may not renovate, expand, modify, or even repair their housing unless they're given express prior permission. And in fact, if they modify or repair a surveyed squatter structure without this permission, they can be subject to clearance. It's a significant constraint on how people are allowed to use and develop their their property. And the Lands Department updates this policy yearly. They conduct aerial LiDAR scanning and on-site scanning or on-site visitation to ensure that people are not breaking this law. And as a result, people who live in Tai O and live in the stilt houses are under significant constraints of what they can do with their buildings. They're not allowed to change them, add on to them, or modify or even repair them without prior permission. So it's a very significant constraint. Moving forward from that, One of the reasons why this is so significant in the contemporary time is because of the role Tai O plays as part of Hong Kong's periphery and urban-rural relationship. So as in the 1970s, commercial fishing was effectively banned in the Pearl River Delta. So, and salt production at Tai O ended around the same period. So increasingly from the 1970s forward into the last part of the 20th century and beginning 21st century, people in Tai O started to rely increasingly on tourism visitation, either from within the region or internationally, to support their livelihood. So you transition from a subsistence fishing and salt production economy to a tourism economy. And this has become a significant part of Tai O's role as a periphery community for Hong Kong. So essentially, people who live in Tai O, the majority of them commute into the city center for higher paying jobs. And then on the kind of flip side of that relationship, people from the center of Hong Kong visit Tai O on the weekends and on holidays as a way to spend a day in the countryside and experience cultural heritage, as they call it. And this has become kind of how Tai O's relationship with the rest of Hong Kong is structured. And so it is a fairly remote community. It takes roughly 2 hours to get there from the central business district, either by the Tung Chung line, which is shown here. You take the Tung Chung line, which is in orange, and then there is a bus that runs along South Lantau Road. So yeah, like I said, about an hour for each leg of the journey, 2 hours total. Alternatively, you can take the ferry from Central to Mui Wo, and then take the same bus line to Tai O, similarly around 2 hours, maybe slightly more. And then alternatively, the other way to get to Tai O is to walk from Tung Chung at the top along the Tung O Ancient Trail, which follows the north coast of Lantau Island, arriving in Tai O at kind of the north part of the village. And so over time, Tai O is seeing an increasing intensification of this role. Not only are residents in Tai O dependent upon tourism visitation for most of their livelihood, unless they commute into the city, which a lot of younger people do, but older people don't. Older people are staying in the village and conducting tours. There's a significant trade in dried fish goods, which people have shrimp paste that they make in Tai O and then sell. A lot of it is actually imported to Tai O, but people who still live there will stay in the village, wait for tourists to come in from the rest of Hong Kong or from the mainland PRC, and come and buy these things or take tours, see the pink dolphins, which are very famous. And arguably, the government of Hong Kong has encouraged this trend. This is a screenshot from the Hong Kong Tourism Board's website, which for years has been promoting Tai O as kind of a rural escape, a chance to see a very unique way of life. And so this role of Tai O as a peripheral tourism settlement, as a kind of release from the city, is explicitly part of the Hong Kong government's agenda. They've increased the amount of attention they pay to Tai O at regional and international levels through the last part of the 20th century and presently. And in 2017, the government formalized this emphasis into planning and policy strategy with a document called the Sustainable Lantau Blueprint. So this was published in 2017, first mentioned in policy in 2008, I believe. And a significant part of it is it designates Tai O as a cultural and ecological tourism center. And this includes infrastructure investment, research investment, development investment in village projects. I think it's around 10 billion Hong Kong, which equates to around 1.3 million US investment in infrastructure improvements and other developmental investments. And these are pages right out of the Sustainable Lantau Blueprint. You can see on the left, number 15, Tai O is circled as a, let's see if they actually say, doesn't say there, but on the right, it talks about the Nature and Cultural Heritage District. So the government has basically stated that part of its strategy for Lantau Island is that the tourism role of Tai O will increase. And this is a significant complex impasse for people who live in Tai O. So they're essentially constrained by the squatter control policy on surveyed squatter structures from renovating, improving, changing the use of, or expanding their stilt houses, while at the same time, the government is making policy that depends on these stilt houses for its strategy into the 21st century. And this is especially complicated because the government has stated that it is unwilling to consider land tenure regularization for squatter houses of any kind, or any changes to colonial legacy policy. And as Alan Smart mentioned in his articles, the pattern that was set up in places like Diamond Hill kind of continues in Tai O, where the government basically neglects informal communities, eventually plans to resume either their lands or their structures, or both in the case of Tai O. And essentially it amounts to stealing the land and stealing the assets of these people over time, or allowing them to kind of succumb to what they call natural wastage. And I'd like to make kind of a transition here and talk a little bit more specifically about architecture and technology. And this is going to start transitioning to our work specifically and how we've responded to this scenario and the situation in Tai O, which is obviously very complex. And we've been working on ways to use a combination of social sciences and design methods to respond to this condition and try to find ways to do what we can to make things better. So that means, in part, I want to talk about technology. And one of the significant factors in how Tai O is coping with its current situation, and when we talk about strategy for Tai O, an issue is that the Pang-uk stilt houses are very fragile. They're light wood construction, very combustible. They're built densely. They're in a flooding and storm hazard zone. This is an image of a fire that took place in June 2020. A colleague of mine took this photo. And part of the justification that the government gives for allowing stilt houses to succumb to natural wastage, to not make larger efforts to conserve them or allow their land tenure status to change, is that they can burn in storms, they get knocked down, they get flooded, etc. So it's kind of an excuse that the government makes to not really do anything. But what's interesting about that, and what we found over the course of, I've been working in Tai O for 4 years, and it's not really that long a time, but I think this has been going on for a while, is that residents of stilt houses in Tai O have made efforts to improve the construction technology of the stilt houses over time. When they are permitted to renovate or add to stilt houses, they usually use more sophisticated and contemporary construction methods and technology. So on the right, we have two images. This was, I think, 2 weekends ago, so this is 2021, very current, of workers fixing a roof on one of those stilt houses. And what they're installing is laminated galvanized steel and extruded polystyrene roofing panels. So in this case, the residents of this stilt house are hoping to improve the insulation value of their roof. Sorry, I just want to really be very careful to mention this because it's a significant amount of work done by other people who are really important in this community. There's also been works by Eddie Tsai Kit and Gary Yeung, who wrote the book on stilt houses, to support Habitat for Humanity projects rebuilding stilt houses. So there are third sector efforts to prevent the stilt houses from falling apart, but also residents, when they rebuild, do invest in improvements to their construction technology. So on the left, this is a project that actually the lands department stopped work on what looks like a kind of composite slab made out of steel and concrete that the residents had specified for rebuilding their stilt house. On the right, this one was reconstructed in 2019, 2020. And you can see some improvements in the siding technology, as well as some thoughts about vapor barrier. And so one of the things that we would argue when the government tries to make arguments about stilt houses not being durable, about them being prone to fire, is given the opportunity, residents in Tai O do try to improve their construction technology on their own, without any incentive, without any help, but because they're people who are as intelligent as anyone else and interested in having a better house for themselves and using contemporary technology. And transitioning into our research and practice work that we've done in Tai O, we've done some work with the Construction Technology Network there to develop some progressions to the stilt house technology. This is an image of a digitally fabricated mold and then fiberglass mold for a concrete footing that we developed with a boat building contractor in Tai O. So I designed and made the object on the left, brought it to Tai O on the train. It was a very interesting morning. and dropped it off with the boat building contractor, who then used fiberglass molding to create the object on the right. And the idea is that this can make a concrete footing for stilt houses that distributes load better, is a little easier to use, demountable, formwork, etc. So we've started to make some efforts in asking how can we work with people in Tai O to improve construction technology. And this is also included on the right. This is Mr. Xin, who is a Sifu, which means construction master of stilt house construction. And we were talking with him about building a multiple piece floor truss to decrease the number of footings that are required to build a stilt house, kind of increase the span between structural columns. We didn't actually end up doing this because it was kind of expensive and we didn't really have a project for it. But it was interesting to work with him because he had deep expertise on how to build stilt houses, what would work about this, what wouldn't. And the demountable parts of the truss was my idea, but Mr. Sheen was really interested in it because Tai O has a lot of areas that have very tight clearances. Small footpaths are how you kind of get around the village. And he was kind of interested in that idea. We weren't able to do it, but we did make the effort. And probably the most significant technological work that we have going on right now, this is by Dr. Markus Wernli, who's one of the designers I work with, is a potential solution for the sewerage problem in Tai O, where we have houses that are basically dropping black water and gray water right into the river estuary and the ocean. And so Markus is designing, with some help from local contractors, this floating toilet raft, which uses a evapotranspiration sewage handling technology to deal with black water for unsewered stilt houses. So we're kind of still working on that. But as I said, I want to return to this diagram and talk a little bit about spatial agency practice and things that we have hit on already. So, you know, digital fabrication and prototyping contributes to our ability to upstream parts of that CNC milled and laser cut mold, which we can then take to people in Tai O and ask them how they would kind of manifest this. And we see this as a form of incremental technology where the question is not, is this the state of the art for construction? Because it's not. But it is something that would make a significant difference there now. And it's kind of one of the things about spatial agency research is thinking about maybe we can't make things perfect, but we could certainly make them better, and we can make it, you know, overcome the state of inertia that Tai O has kind of been caught in. So just to return to this diagram, these are some efforts that I think we've made in this direction. Larger work and longer term work, we've been working with the with nonprofits in Tai O to develop what we're calling a collaborative governance regime. And the most significant project with this is relates to a data commons effort that is happening right now. So starting in spring 2020, we started conducting online workshops with stakeholders in Tai O around themes of tourism, transportation, and community projects, asking questions like, how do you feel about tourism development? What do you see as positive impacts about that? What do you see as negative? What would you think is a positive improvement to the transportation situation in Tai O? If money was spent on community projects, what would you want them to do? Questions like that. And this is kind of the workshop material that I developed on the lower right. Wasn't allowed to use it because COVID happened. We couldn't meet in person. But we heard a lot during these workshops about frustration with traffic into and out of Tai O because of tourism visitation. And in response to this, we recently rolled out this initiative, and we started working on it with the Tai O Rural Committee and Tai O YWCA in November 2020. And what we proposed to do was to set up a way to monitor pedestrian traffic into and out of the village. Now, I want to take kind of a side note here because some of the conversations that we had with the Rural Committee reflect really interestingly on the kind of smart city premise that you may have heard of. Smart city is research and technology premise really interested in ideas about data use in governance, planning, and development for cities. And we actually received a question from one of the members of the Tai O Rural Committee because the way we're doing pedestrian traffic monitoring is really rudimentary. It's infrared monitoring gate, which basically uses 2 infrared beams. And when an object, a person or otherwise, crosses them, it counts how many people and what direction they're going. So it's very rudimentary. It requires on-site visits to use the technology. I'll talk about it more in a second. But one of the things that members of the Tai O Rural Committee said is, well, why don't we use GPS? Why don't we use more sophisticated technology? And we had a slightly different response to that in the meeting, but I want to talk about this image in reference to this premise really briefly. Some of you may have heard, in 2019, there was significant civil unrest and protests in Hong Kong, which were summarily crushed by the government over the extradition law, which effectively allows the Hong Kong government to extradite Hong Kong residents to the northern part of People's Republic of China for trial, depending on offenses. And this led to a very long, very painful series of protests, entire districts of the city being locked down, tear gas everywhere. But one of the things that happened during this is this lamppost, which is in Kontong, was torn down by protesters because they were upset that it is a smart city monitoring piece of equipment. It records people passing this point in the street as a way of monitoring traffic. And the government, as always says that this has very innocent and benign motivations for doing this. But of course, if you know anything about the technology used in the People's Republic of China, facial recognition is a major technological strategy that they use for controlling the population, finding people who are dissidents. It's a really big problem. So people tore this down during the protests, and that contributes pretty significantly to how we think about technology in a spatial agency framework. As I'm looking at this, I was thinking about it earlier, and it says accessibility affects how technology performs. That doesn't necessarily mean how the technology performs for its technical aim. It means how technology performs politically and socially. How accessible technology is, who is allowed to use it, repair it, work with it, affects the political performance of that technology. And so the solution we came up with for Tai O, monitoring pedestrian traffic in Tai O, looks like this. The infrared monitors on the inside, there's a 3D printed enclosure on the outside. And we propose to mount these in 6, later changed to 8 on the Rural Committee's advice, locations in Tai O to understand how many people were coming in and out of the village at different times and different places. And again, in an agency framework, there's a serious difference in investment and accessibility and feedback for this technology as compared to the smart city lamppost. It costs roughly $80 without installation costs. It's very easy to remove, which is good and bad for us. Sometimes we have problems with people messing with them. But there's something about this, it achieves the same goal of monitoring traffic, but it doesn't require 18 months of run-up in planning meetings in order to get it put into place. And if people have objections to it, it can be removed with a pair of scissors, which is a pretty significant difference as compared to a lamppost. And so we have these installed in 8 places in Tai O. Here are 2 of the install locations. They're at major connections between the village and infrastructure. And we're already gathering data from them. And I think this is something about, again, spatial agency framework. I think it's significant that I have to go to Tai O to get this data. And people see the data. We post the findings on the monitors as we take them in. And hopefully, at least, this reflects on a politics of space in Tai O rather than a policing of space, which is kind of one of our semi-polemic goals in the work that we're doing. That to me relates to, back to this diagram once again, governance, digital fabrication, and situated knowledge production all kind of working together. So the situated knowledge is the data, governance is working collaboratively with the Rural Committee, and in a very serious way, digital fabrication and prototyping is what makes it possible. But really quickly, I want to talk about, and I'm coming to the end here, I know I've probably gone a little long. I want to talk briefly about strategic development effort that we have underway. And this is really in early stages. We haven't done the work to make this collaborative work yet. So it may go nowhere. It's kind of internally oriented right now, but I think it's interesting and I want to talk with you about it. So this is the Tai O Rural Committee Historic and Cultural Showroom. And I showed this image earlier. It is on this map point 1 down here at the bottom in the south. As you come off the bus into Tai O, which is the way most people enter the village, you pass by this building on the right side. The image on the right is what it looks like on the inside. It's a collection of artifacts and photographs from Tai O's history. Really amazing things, you know, salt production equipment, fishing equipment, documentation of people mending nets, really a lot of the kind of ephemera of this unique way of life that happened in Tai O. And we've started talks early of working with the rural committee to renovate this building into a tourism center. And I think one of the roles that it could play is using slightly more sophisticated, but still relatively simple technology. It could monitor and understand how many tourist visitors are coming into Tai O per day. You know, you could do other things like gathering tourist visitation data. Why are you here? What brought you to Tai O? How did you hear about it? How many days are you staying, etc. It's also a really fascinating space. You know, you have this kind of drop ceiling on the bottom, and this is what the showroom is. And if you go into the back part of the building and you go above the drop ceiling, which you can see on the left side of this image, this is what it looks like. It is a former toy and beverage factory that they turned into the showroom. And there's this amazing space that is potentially there. You know, again, trained as an architect, can't help myself, really interested in this space. But we developed some, again, early days, pre-designed schemes to present to the rural committee about how they could renovate this space into a tourism visitation, traffic control facility that we think would really make a difference. So when we talk about strategic development, we think this is something that could really contribute to people in Tai O understanding what's happening in the village, being able to pool resources, get tourism information as a collective rather than individual people, and overcome problems like, for instance, the bus company. We've asked for ridership data from them 1,000 times, and they just say no, they have no incentive to help out. Another thing we're working on, again, very early days, is that the Civil Engineering and Development Department recently had a public consultation on some facilities they want to build in Tai O, major one of which is this. And so this is the Lung Tin housing estate on the left. The still houses are kind of up in the upper right of this image. And part of what they're suggesting is to build a new footbridge at Im Tin, which is here on the right, and then also to renovate this facility into what you see here, this rendering. So from a strategic development point of view, you'll notice that there's a significant amount of parking added, which is for private coaches. So in a village of about 3,000 people, you might see a doubling of that population over the course of a day. And the Civil Engineering and Development Department is helping to make that happen, but in my personal opinion, not doing the work that it should to make sure that that is something that people in Tai O are aware of and can handle, especially in the time of COVID. And I'll come back to that in a second. I want to talk about COVID. A lot of people in Tai O are elderly, and people are coming to the village with the understanding that mask enforcement is not an issue there, entering the village without masks and exposing an majority over 65 population to COVID. So I think the government probably should take more responsibility for this tourism development than they are when they design facilities like this. And this is probably not going to go anywhere, but we have proposed some alternatives of how this could work. And what this is a combination of tourism visitation center, but also a storm shelter. And the idea is that along with the Cantonese Opera Theater, which is what you see here, that kind of small building, this facility would support during storm events. It would allow people to seek shelter in the building in a community facility, and it would also control the flow of tourists in private coaches as they enter the village. And this is kind of an in-progress drawing. We're still working on this. Sorry, it's pretty rough. But you can see tourists from coaches could enter on the right. There's an office for the rural committee in the lower right corner. And then there could be a kind of up into in the northeast of the facility would be a educational facility, talk to tourists, tell them what's going on. The Cantonese Opera facilities on the left side, bathrooms on the south side. So this is our kind of alternative proposal for how that facility could work, how that property could be used, and probably, at least from what we heard from stakeholders we've talked to, offer something that people in Tai O actually want. as opposed to this. And I think without me commenting too much on the design, you can kind of form your own opinions. And so basically that's the end. That's our work. And I think in a spatial agency framework, we're really trying to find solutions and find ways forward as much as we can. We don't think we can solve Tai O's situation. It's very complex. And obviously it's an urban environment. Different people have different opinions on what should or should not happen there. But we do think with a combination of soft power, collaborative interactions with people, but also design and technology, we can help people at least be more aware of and have more agency over what happens in Tai O in the future. And that is it. That's my talk. So thank you. Thank you for listening. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, Daniel. That was fascinating.
Sure.
Very, very complex context that you're working in. I love that phrase that you said, maybe we can't make things perfect, but we can certainly make them better, which is, I guess, anyone working, I work in our informal settlements, and there's just so many layers that you have to unpack, but you have to kind of start somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
I guess want to open the floor for some questions. We have about 12 minutes till your next lecture for some of you. So does anyone have any questions for Daniel? Any takers?
Silence as usual.
Okay, I guess I'll start.
I'll jump in. Well, I'll get it started.
Okay.
Sorry, Heidi.
No, go for it.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. I think, yeah, lots of layers to your presentation that one can dip into, and I think also quite a few parallels with a lot of places in South Africa and Africa. So I was thinking about this idea, or where the government sits in terms of, on the one hand, keeping the status quo, on the other hand, incremental upgrade, and on the other hand, displacement, or like quite a heavy-handed intervention. So on the one hand, they're promoting this romanticizing of hardship almost, and the place as a curiosity in the tourism website, and then building quite a drastic intervention to promote this keeping of a status quo almost. But on the inverse, how do they sit in terms of the upgrading? So you need permission, and on the one hand, it doesn't seem like they want it upgraded, and on the other, there's this layer of displacement as well. So yeah, I don't know. Can you talk a bit about that maybe?
Yeah, I mean, so I think with the Hong Kong government, you always have to ask yourself the question, or propose maybe, let's assume they're acting in good faith. Let's assume that things we hear from stakeholders about their ambition to take the land back from villagers are not real. Let's assume that's not real for a second. They essentially sit on their hands, and any improvement to still houses comes from the third sector. It's all Habitat for Humanity, the YWCA, and probably the greatest threat to Tai O continuing as a settlement where people actually live is demography. As I said, most of the residents of still houses are over 65. Their children and grandchildren, they live in other places. They live in Hong Kong, in the rest of the city. And because of the land tenure situation, increasingly few of them, or decreasing numbers of them, have interest in living in a still house. And so, there's very telling language in the most recent press releases from the government, where they say things like, we'd like to see third sector efforts to conserve the still houses with an eye towards later resuming them for public use and consumption. And so the premise that people actually live there and engage in any kind of, normal housing cycle or normal real estate development doesn't even occur on the government's agenda. And Alan Smart is really the person who's written most extensively about this. He refers to it as, tolerance, neglect, resumption, demolition. tolerance, neglect, demolition, resumption. And he even draws connections between the public housing program, which was started at the same time that the informal settlements in Diamond Hill were demolished. And so, again, if the government is acting in bad faith, or good faith, they're making the situation worse through inertia. And if they're not, they're stealing land. So it kind of depends on how you think about it.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting balance between. I mean, I know the Chinese government is not nostalgic in any way about heritage or kind of cultural value. You know, I mean, like my dad lived in Shanghai for many years, and I always found that Yuan temple complex to be the most bizarre. You know, it's the cultural heritage, but it's basically Disneyland. You know, it's just tourist shops, and the government basically kept the housing but kicked everyone out. So it almost feels like they have a similar agenda for this village in a way.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. To me, it comes back to the question of what culture is. You know, is it the houses themselves or the people who live in them? And there's also examples like Nongping is an example of the same pattern, where it's basically been taken over as you said, Disneyland. It's bizarre. It's a village. It is culture, but it's all local chains or international chains. Very, very strange. I see there's a question here on the chat. Why was fishing in the river disallowed? This problem is very similar to South African historical fishing villages where permissible fishing is not sustainable. So fishing on a personal level is still allowed. What is prohibited is trawling fishing, and this is mostly concerned with the Pearl River Delta and Great Bay. And so people in Tai O do still fish. Subsistence fishing is allowed. Whether or not it's necessarily a great idea in the Pearl River Delta is another question. But it's also, again, demography. There's fewer and fewer people who are living the kind of fishing way of life anymore, but it is still allowed for now.
I think Brian's Haraf has a question.
Of course it does. Like it hurts.
I always have a question. Thanks, Dan. But I think there's a point here to be emphasized for the South African students. There's a lot of things they might recognize as being similar or overlapping with what they see in the informal settlements around them. But the difference is here is, in fact, I think the very premise of it, and maybe for the students, sorry, I'm outside, so there's a lot of noise. But I think what would be good for the students is actually, if you actually Google what Hong Kong looks like in terms of its CBD, in terms of its density, and in terms of just it's and do a little bit of reading, because I think when you understand the neoliberalization that's happening in the city, then you start realizing just how threatened a place like Tai O is, and how hard these people are actually fighting to have a level of survival and continuation. And it's not just, and Dan, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's not just one generation, it's intergenerational living conditions, if you're right. And it's both in terms of living as well as construction that is being, extended beyond just one, but it actually goes on 2 or 3 layers in terms of family. So just make this comparison. And, what Dan didn't mention is Tai O Village is next to the second busiest airport in the world, where we usually have 90 million visitors passing through that point. So if you think about that, and you think about the money, and you think about what Tai O really represents, then I think there's a very, very interesting problem that presents itself socially, spatially, materially. So for the students, do a little bit of homework and ask yourself, how do you really understand it, and what lessons can you take away from this? I just want to say that because I think it's really important to emphasize this, that context becomes very clear in terms of the setting of Tai O. Thanks.
Do we have any other questions? Anyone from the floor? We have about 3-5 minutes.
Hi.
Hi, Leslie.
just a little question, nothing too like drastic. And again, like when they go through council, how often is it that they will not council, but like when they request, say there's a failure or structural problem, if they request that they can, you know, like they said you have to get permission first to actually fix anything. Does that come through often, or is there like, you know, like if the request is made, is there much, like, because I saw, you know, the where you were building, where there was like new cladding and new supports for that one building that you showed us. You know, how often does that get introduced? I guess that's something.
That's a good question. Just to be really clear, the new construction of that still house is not my work. That's someone building for themselves. I don't have actually, you know, I don't have data talking to people about this yet, but I would say a matter of weeks. So the lands department and buildings department send people out roughly every 2 weeks. They conduct a site survey to make sure people aren't encroaching on government land. So they're fairly active, and my understanding, at least from what I know so far, I would like to have more data, is a matter of weeks to a month, to go from, you know, something has happened and then someone makes a change. In the aftermath of things like the fire in the year 2000, the flood in 2013, the fire in 2010, you saw action happening a lot faster. So the lands department would expedite permits to kind of move things forward. But yeah, it's a good question. We should get the numbers on that and see if we can quantify that more clearly. But it
crazy
is
that turnover is just quite amazingly fast in like a context that we like live in. 2 weeks to see.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because the government, the lands department in particular, you know, they act as if time is on their side, and then you could argue that it is, where essentially they don't need to be extraordinarily difficult with people in order for things to kind of progress in Tai O towards people moving out, and there is a little bit of that kind of hypocritical liberalism left over from the colonial era, where the lands department is responsive, especially when disasters happen. So it's fairly quick, as far as I understand. But yeah, we should quantify that more. That'd be a great thing to know for sure.
Okay, I think we're rapidly losing audience members because it's 2 o'clock. Yeah, tight deadlines. Anyway, I really want to thank you, Daniel, for the amazing talk. It's really, really interesting to see work in different contexts. And thanks again, Mike, for, you know, setting this up. Really, really inspiring. And yeah, I think we'll look forward to seeing, you know, maybe having you back in a year or two to see how the projects have progressed.
Here's hoping. Yeah. Things never move as fast as we hope, but thank you for having me, and thanks, Mike, for organizing. I really appreciate it.
Oh, yeah. Thanks, Daniel. Thanks, Heidi. That was great.
What about the colloquia?
Mm-hmm.
What about it?
Okay, well, yeah, Dan, have a great evening, and everyone else, have a great afternoon. We'll see you soon.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for listening. Thanks for having me. Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.